Again, welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, the Golden Pack, Wild Dogs of the Okavango Delta, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Russell Gerber. It's a pleasure to hear from you today, Russell. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you, Kendall, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's my pleasure to be back for my second webinar with you folks. So today, we of course will be chatting about the Golden Pack, and it is my pleasure to introduce these wonderful and unique animals to you folks for today. So let's get started. As many of you know, my name is Russell Gerber, and I'm coming to you live from Cape Town today. And I've been guiding with NatHab since 2018, but I've been in the field for many years. That's a picture of me and my lovely wife on safari. I actually studied an undergraduate degree in zoology and vertebrate biology, African vertebrate biology, but I always had a passion for marine biology, and that's really what I focused on right after my undergrad. But the safari bug always had me, and I decided after finishing my studies that I wanted to spend some time in the field, and I thought no better way to do that than to get involved in the safari industry. And I became a safari guide in 2004 in a part of South Africa known as Pinda, which is the northeastern part of the country. So it was a beautiful experience, and I was a guide there for about 2 years. And since then, I've been a guide in both marine and safari fields since 2004 all the way through until today. So many years in the field. I've spent the last year or so whilst we've been cooped up at home working as a wildlife presenter, which has been loads of fun and something quite different, and of course doing webinars just like this one. So that's just a little bit about myself, and yeah, for those of you who know me, it's good to see you all again. But today, what are we talking about? We're going to be going through various aspects of this particular group of animals and talking about who is the Golden Pack. We're going to be talking about them in particular, but in relation to wild dogs in general, the African wild dog in general, going through their adaptations and evolution, not only as a species, but also for the Okavango Delta itself and how unique that area is. We'll be touching on their life history, going through various aspects of the dogs themselves as a general species information, and going through hunting strategies and techniques, which is partly covered in the last webinar that I did in the iconic predators of Africa. And then we'll be chatting about threats to wild dogs, from various species of animals to even diseases. And then lastly, the conservation status and strategies currently in place for the species itself, but again, in particular relation to the Golden Pack in the Occupango Delta. And lastly, touching on, of course, where they are, what's happening with that Golden Pack today and what they're up to. I sadly haven't been out to see them in recent months, possibly for the last year, but I have got some information on that too, and we'll just touch on that before we close out today. So wild dogs in general, where are they found? And this is a distribution map, of course, of Africa. All the red markings you can see throughout the continent are the current range of the African wild dog on the continent. Now, historically, they actually occurred almost all the way through to North Africa, above the desert area up towards Egypt even, and then the thin band you can actually see of the red all around the equatorial forests of the Congo, and then down towards the southwestern parts of the country or the continent. That spotted distribution you can see now was actually one solid band around about 100 years ago. So with the growth of population and the loss of wildlife habitats over the last 50 years or so, as it occurred in so many places around the world, the distributions have become quite patchy, and that of course leads to its own issues when it comes to the genetic diversity of a species. But wild dogs in particular have been susceptible to a number of different threats, which we'll be touching on later. But the takeaway from all of this is, of course, the nature of the species itself, which is now listed as endangered. We think there's roughly around 4,000 to 6,000 of them left on the continent, with the majority of them being found around East Africa, Tanzania, into Kenya, and then down south towards Zambia, and then of course Botswana, which is that huge red patch in the center of the map towards the southern parts of the continent. So we're going to be focusing on that area today. So this is a map of Botswana. This is, of course, one of the wonderful areas that we go on safari with natural habitat. And the focus for us today is going to be on the Okavango Delta. So if you look at the map, towards the top of the map, you'll actually find that that is where the delta is itself. So it's very much the northeastern part of the country, and it is reliant on its neighbors for the water. The water actually flows down from neighboring Angola, which you can just see the border for Angola in the top of your screen, along with Zambia. But the source for the delta is actually from Angola, which we're going to touch on in just a moment. So focusing in on that area, here is the Occupango itself, and the red area is the particular range that we're going to be talking about today. This is very much the home range of the golden pack, also the area for a number of other packs that occur in the region, but there is some overlap, and we'll be touching on that when it comes to the distribution of this particular species in just a little while. But that gives you a very much focused idea of what we're going to be talking about and the area we'll be talking about today with regard to these wonderful predators. The particular concession, and the concession is an area that is designated for a certain owner, which in Botswana is leased from the government. So various concession owners can lease that property normally for about 50 years, and they then have the opportunity to do wildlife activities on the reserve. So it also has to be very much as low impact as possible in terms of the environment itself, which is why you find most of your accommodations in Botswana tend to be tented safaris, to have as little impact on the natural environment itself. But this area in particular, the Kwedi concession, is actually an area that I worked once upon a time. I was actually a camp manager in that area, the general manager of a wonderful reserve, or lodge known as Bumbra Plains. And as you can see here, it's in the northeastern part of the Occupango, bearing in mind that the Occupango Delta itself is around 18,000 square kilometers. So a really, really huge area. And now we're talking about the whole Delta area itself. So an area that is particularly unique, and certainly one of my favorite places to visit on the continent, and in the world for that matter. But many people ask, what is the Okavango Delta? Why is it there? What makes it so special? And it is actually a very interesting phenomenon. It's a delta that really shouldn't be there. In many cases, people actually refer to it as the Occupango Swamp, because it's not a delta running into the ocean, which is the technical term for it. So what you're seeing here is very much water that has formed or run into major rivers coming from Angola. So the start of us, or the source of it, as I mentioned, is right in the highlands of Angola. It then travels south, joined by a couple of other rivers, which eventually become the Okavango River, running into the delta itself. Now, this is a slightly depressed area, and the water itself actually runs into there, and there's a small fault line at the bottom of the delta where you can see Maun, that little town where we normally fly in for our safaris. That's very much on the fault line itself, and the fault line runs at about a 45-degree angle from the bottom left up to the top right. That fault line actually stops the water itself really from going any further south, and that is the reason that the delta is how it is. As I said, it's a slightly depressed region, formed around 50,000 years ago, so it's a relatively new region when it comes to geological time, but a very, very special area, because what's happened here is that fault that occurred around 50,000 years ago has created this incredible oasis on its own, an area that is technically desert. It's all part of the Kalahari Desert, and the delta flows into it, and eventually all that water dries up every year. So the majority of the water that flows in dries. You'll still have some permanent channels, but for the most part, the flooded areas each year, which generally come through around June, by the time you get to October, November, those areas are dry again, and only the permanent channels remain. And obviously with that, you're going to have a number of things that the dogs of the region and various predator and prey species have to deal with and consider in order to thrive and survive in the Occupango itself. So now we've got to talk about the dogs themselves. So of course, the golden pack is part of the species, the African wild dog, Lycaon pictus, which literally means painted wolf. That's pretty much the translation from the scientific name itself. Now, it's considered Africa's most endangered large predator, and we're going to come to the reasons why that is the case a little later on in the conversation, but it makes them really, really interesting and a very special animal to see while you're out on safari. But what we've got to touch on first, of course, and what we're talking about today is who is the golden pack. So this was a picture I took while because it was the first time that I'd actually got such a clear view of one of the young males. You can see this is a young male who was this amazingly light color, very different to the typical coloration of a wild dog, which I'll show you, of course, in a few moments. But it was such a great shot to see them standing out in the open like this, because generally, for those of you who've been on safari before and lucky enough to see these dogs in the wild, they move fast, they move quick, you're generally chasing them down through the bush. But this was a moment of peace where I managed to get this shot of a beautiful example of one of the members of the golden pack and how they got the name, the golden pack itself. Now, chatting to a few of my colleagues from the area, they tell me that the pack originated around 30 years ago, and the original pack had about 25 individuals. Now, that's quite fluid when it comes to various reasons, from dispersal of the animals, which we'll also talk about in a moment, of course, to the animals dying either in a hunt and getting injured or being taken out by other potential threats. So it is a changing pack, and it's a natural thing for that to happen in the wild dog world. But as you can see, this one, of course, is more golden. And in a moment, I'll show you some pictures where you'll see that all the different individuals in the pack themselves have different colorations and patterns in the coat. Now, what's cool about the dogs themselves is that every individual wild dog has its own unique coat pattern, very much like a fingerprint. So the face tends to be quite similar, but the body itself, the markings all over the body are generally very different, and a way for you to actually identify individuals in the field. Now, the golden color of these particular individuals is also quite helpful and makes them even more unique. As I mentioned earlier, they're commonly seen around the Kwedi concession. The Vumbra Plains area was very much where they were first described as a pack. So here you can see a more recent picture of the pack itself, and you've got one of the more golden pups on the left, and then a more typical colored pup on the right. So what's going on here? Why are some of them this light color? Is it albinism? Is it leucism? And it's actually an interesting debate. We've had lots of chats, myself and colleagues, about it. It's certainly not albinism. The reason for that is that there is still melanin in the coloration of these dogs. You can see that their nose, the mouth, the eyes are all dark in color, brown, dark brown around the muzzle. And then you can still see some coloration and patterning down the legs. Now, these pups are a little dirty. They've just been digging through the carcass of a impala, very unfortunate impala. But if you look carefully down the legs, you can see on that one on the left, the dark coloration spot. So that suggests that it's not an albino individual. It is likely to be more leucistic. Now, whether that is true leucism is the argument. It could just be a genetic variation, and some of them are lighter than others. But for this particular example, we could say, as a broad explanation for the lighter coloration in the pack, you could argue that it is due to a form of leucism. Now, life in the Delta, as I mentioned, you have animals that have to deal with very different seasons. Now, if any of you have ever been down to the Occupango, you would have known that around October, the staff often refer to it as suicide month because it is so hot there. We're talking on average temperatures around 40 degrees Celsius most days. And that doesn't tend to dissipate much in the evenings. So you have these extremely high temperatures and very, very dry weather around the August, September, October time. As we head into November and December, we start to get some rainfall, local rainfall in the Delta, which gives some relief. But that's not really where the major water comes from. As I explained earlier, the major water is actually coming from the flooding that takes place in the Angolan highlands. Normally around that same time, around November, December, the rains will be falling in the highlands and then slowly makes its way down into the Delta, generally arriving around the end of May, around about now into June, where the Delta will start filling up with water from the rainfall in the highlands. So it's variable. You never know how much rain you're going to get. There can be years where the flood really doesn't go a long way into the Delta. Some years, because of the channels that have been created by the movement of elephants and hippos, certain channels will get more water and certain parts of the Delta will flood more than others. So it's a very much changing environment on an annual basis. And in this photograph, you can see a very, very dry environment, and typical to see around the October, November time of year. So the dogs have to deal with that. But because they're such good long distance runners, running long distances on dry land like this is a huge advantage for them. And for many of the predator species, even though they can give birth pretty much any time of year, they tend to have more youngsters around this time of year. So most young are born around winter, from about March to September. So the pups for the dogs are born around that time. And mostly 2 to 10 pups will be in one litter. And for about 3 months, they'll be very close to the den. So while they're hanging around the den, they'll come back, feed the mom with the pups and or the babysitters that are looking after the pups. But the pack has to come back. And if there's a litter of around 10 pups, they'll have to be coming back twice a day, hunting twice a day, which of course can be really challenging for a group of animals, even though they tend to be quite successful, which we'll get to as well. Another thing, of course, they have to deal with in the Delta is it's a wet place. So as I mentioned, when we get into May, June, and July, you've got a lot of water in the Delta. It's absolutely inundated in certain years. So the dogs have to cross certain channels if they want to stay with their prey. And that means you have to be able to swim, you have to be able to run through fairly shallow water and be really agile and adapted to actually running in the mud, which can be very tricky for an animal that has a very small footprint. You know, they don't have wide paws that can spread out and give them some relief in the mud. And very often you'll see them getting caught up when they are chasing prey in the mud like that. So it's something that they have to deal with. And for dogs who use that technique of running down their prey to exhaustion, it can be very difficult for them to keep up, considering some of their prey species, which we'll get to in just a moment. So here you can see another group of them, and this is the much more typical coloration that you see of wild dogs. This is also a photo of the golden pack with some of the individuals that are much more normal color. And you can see here almost no sign of that golden coloration, bearing in mind that every member in this pack is related in some way to the pups that we saw. So what will happen eventually is that you'll have either a group of males or a group of females disperse, and that is how they will actually have genetic dispersal. Again, we'll chat about that in a moment, but they all look after the same group of animals. They're all reliant on each other, and they look after the pups as a team. So With that, that means, of course, they hunt in packs. They'll get back to the den and actually regurgitate food for the pups and for the moms, as I mentioned. But what's difficult for them is that they also have large territories. They're more home ranges than territories, but at the same time, they can be huge areas simply depending on how much food is available. In the Delta, at certain times of the year when there's lots of food available and lots of impala and other species like that around, for them it's much easier, and their home ranges won't extend so far. So they can stay closer to that den for, as I said, around 3 months. So the whole pack supports the pups. And as I mentioned, the dispersal of the males and females from the original pack takes place when a few of them will decide to move off together. And what happens is that group of males or group of females will meet up with another group of nomadic males or females, and often then start their own pack, where once again there will be an alpha breeding pair and sometimes a beta breeding pair as well, which will give birth to some pups too. But for the most part, it's just the alpha pair who will be doing the breeding. When it comes to the science of these animals and how they can be successful, it's been basically reported that you need around 9 different packs in a particular region or in a certain region to drive genetic diversity. So you have to have at least 9 packs available for that genetic diversity to stay strong for the species. Now that's going to be important in a moment while we're going to chat about that, because it's very much a difficulty that we have in terms of the conservation of the particular species. So here's another shot of the pack itself. You can see this is with some of the more normal coloration individuals, and then you'll see some of the lighter ones as well, in particular in the left of the middle of the screen, and then there's one in the far side of the screen as well, also slightly lighter than the others. So it's not clearly leucism, as I mentioned, but it is certainly a lighter coloration, less melanin in the fur that we're seeing there. The dogs are prolific hunters. They are cooperative predators. And one of the things that have been reported in the research of this particular group of dogs is that they've noted that when they do go out for a hunt, often the dogs will sneeze to each other. And it's suggested that that's almost a form of communication, saying, okay, it's time to head out and go and do a hunt. I've actually seen that before. I didn't know that it was the topic of an actual study, but it is something that has been presented, and always something I found really interesting about this particular group of dogs. As we spoke about, they've got really high endurance for chasing down their prey species. They tend to go for small to medium things like impala, and in this area, red lechery as well, and that will be the focus for dogs. But if you've got a pack of 14 to 25 individuals, it's a lot of mouths to feed, and that's why they generally hunt twice a day. So they're crepuscular hunters, suggesting that mostly in the mornings and the early evenings will be the times that they do their hunting, which is pretty typical for a species like this. They're very much trying to avoid competition too from lions, of course, and some others, which we'll get to. They have difficulty defending against scavengers because they're much slighter in their body size than the other bigger predators, and that's another challenge for them, and why they tend to focus on hunting during the day when your other big predators tend to focus on hunting in the night. They've got a very high success rate of hunting as well, around 60 to 70% in this particular region, despite the challenges with the shallow water that they often have to run through. Their simple ability to keep running animals down without tiring, and they'll just switch. So you'll have one who's running lead, and then that one gets tired, another one will take over, and they just keep switching through until eventually they chase that animal down. So it's an amazing thing to watch, but they are really, really good and successful hunters. This was a clip also from the last chat that I did with you folks, but just an amazing clip of just after a successful hunt with the golden pack. So just a short little clip for you to see the end of what was a very frightened impala, but an amazing sight with these elephants dust bathing in the background. So have a look at this. And once again, you can see some of the lighter individuals right near the front of your picture here, still grabbing a few pieces of what's left of that impala. The dog on the far left has still got the horns and head in its mouth, so if you're a little squeamish, now would be the time to turn away. But that's pretty typical for a dog hunt. And to paint the picture for you folks, this hunt took place. We were lucky enough to be watching them before they started. They did that sneezing, then they all ran off and started trotting, looking for their prey. Within 5 minutes, they'd found a herd of impala, and not 2 minutes later, they'd chased down and killed this dog, this antelope. And within 5 minutes after that, pretty much the entire carcass was gone. And that's very typical. You know, this is part of that scene. Again, pretty gory, but it is a natural part of the life of the dogs, and in particular, the species that they tend to go for. You know, so impala, which is this, not red lechery, which we'll get to in a moment, but impala tends to be their most typical species that they will go for. It's just really the perfect size for them to take down. It tends to feed them fairly well, and it's just something that tends to be their target species. Red lechery is a antelope unique to the Occupango, which are much more adapted for running through the water. So they've got wide split hooves that allow them to run over the mud and move a little quicker. So they have a bit more of an advantage over the impala when it comes to escaping. The same could be said for the reedbuck that you find in the area, waterbuck, all similar species that can use that adaptation of the wider hoof split to actually run through the mud and escape from the dogs. Kudu, which tends to be quite common in this area too, they'll go for younger kudu. I have seen them take down a big adult kudu before, but it's more often than not the younger ones that they'll focus on. And then once again, you still have to hunt a second time in a day if you've got lots of mouths to feed. Now, what are the threats to these lovely dogs? And of course, your biggest threat for them really are the big mammalian predators in the Okavango. Hyena is one of their major enemies, and very often you'll have groups of hyena actually following the pack of dogs before they go on a hunt. They know how successful they are, and because of the size and power of hyena, they can often actually push their way into a kill and actually take over if there aren't enough dogs around. If there's a big pack of dogs, even 2 or 3 hyenas won't be enough to chase them off. But if the clan of hyenas arrives anywhere around 10 hyenas, they will absolutely chase those dogs off because they are much more powerful jaws, and just generally much heavier animals. So that's definitely one that they have to be aware of in terms of the threats to the dogs themselves. Another one, of course, is leopard. They tend to have less direct competition with the leopard, but I watched a video very recently from this week. It was down here in South Africa of a leopard actually catching something that the dogs were chasing first. And miraculously, that impala managed to escape both those animals. But leopard, if they find dogs that are not aware of them, or let's say a single dog out on a hunt that is unaware of its presence, the leopard can and will kill a wild dog. They are much more powerful and strong, and certainly a threat to adults as well as cubs, of course, or pups. If they find the den of pups unattended, they would absolutely kill the pups simply for competition. And then, of course, lions are a major threat to dogs, much more powerful than them as well. It's part of the reason that we have the dogs doing most of their hunting during the day. You know, most lions will spend the day sleeping and gathering energy for their hunts at night. They also have better eyesight at night than the dogs, which gives them the advantage over them too. So the cats tend to be more relaxed during the day, and that's not to say they don't hunt during the day. They absolutely will if they need to, but they tend to avoid each other in that way. And the dogs, of course, completely outgunned when it comes to the big cats, so they do their best to avoid them if they can. Lions will happily scavenge a kill from any species that they can chase off. And as I mentioned, dogs being much more slight in body size than the lions, they'll easily scare them off. So that is certainly a threat that they need to be aware of. But the biggest thing for dogs that really challenges their future is disease. Because of the nature of them, their denning nature, whenever disease is encountered, and often it's with domestic animals outside the reserves, we tend to see the entire pack getting infected with these diseases, like canine distemper, rabies, etc. And because of those huge ranges that we spoke about, they'll often go out of the reserves, and it's difficult to keep them in. And when they do go into these areas, we get these human-wildlife conflict zones. And when that happens, almost always, the animals tend to lose out, certainly the wild animals. So disease is really the major killer of wild dogs today. And because of the location of the golden pack, and it's surrounded by a huge area of protected Occupango, due to the simple nature of the flooding of the delta, there's just not a lot of human settlement there. So they haven't had this impact of disease as much as many of their cousins on the outskirts of the reserves, well, of the delta itself. And what's being done? What are people doing out there to look after the dogs? Well, in this particular case, it's the Botswana Predator Conservation Trust, and they've been involved with the study and research and conservation of this particular pack and many other packs in the Occupango for about 20 years now. So they've got unique information on the pack itself, and are just doing amazing things in terms of understanding all the various aspects of these dogs, which 20 or 30 years ago we really didn't know much about. They were considered to be a pest in many parts of Africa, and were shot on sight by many farmers with the idea that these animals would wantonly kill cattle or livestock at any opportunity. This is actually not true. They will, if they get the opportunity, take one or two, but they were never the wanton killers that they were suggested to be. So Botswana Predator Conservation Trust, they've done programs where they've done radio telemetry collars on the particular alpha males or females to follow the pack itself. And that's simply to keep an eye on them and to make sure that we can understand their dispersal patterns and all the various population dynamics of the pack itself. It's never used to find them on safari. We get asked that quite a lot, but it's actually quite difficult to use the telemetry to find them successfully, particularly if you only have a few hours on safari. But that has been a huge help in actually just gaining knowledge about the pack itself. And then, of course, the movement of the animals between conservation areas. I touched on earlier the 9 different packs being needed in a particular region for genetic diversity. And because of the limited number of the dogs, particularly in South Africa, where they started to see these populations dropping off about 20 years ago, they've started to actually physically move different dispersing males or females long distances, sometimes to other reserves within South Africa, but also between Botswana and South Africa to increase this diversity as much as possible. How they do that is actually tend to take 2 different groups. So it'll be a group of females, let's say 3 females from one pack, and then 3 females or 3 males from another pack. They will then introduce them into the new region, into a boma. So it's what we call a soft reintroduction. They'll go into a boma, which is a small fenced area where they'll get to know each other, the males and the females. And then once they've been in there for about 2 or 3 weeks, they'll let them out. So they've imprinted on each other, and then they go forth and start their own pack from there. So it's been a really successful program in increasing the population numbers. Another thing they've been looking at, particularly in Botswana and around South Africa, around Kruger National Park, is the vaccination and treatment of domestic dogs. They're trying to get, of course, any rabies or distemper under control with the domestic animals. It's very difficult to control the dogs from getting out of the reserves, even with fences. So these kinds of programs are really, really helpful in protecting the dogs themselves. The most common, of course, is also trying to increase protected areas, but with such massive ranges, it's a difficult thing to do to get enough space for dogs, for wild dogs in particular. And so even though that is still ongoing, for the moment, it's not really enough to simply increase the areas. We've had to physically move certain members of the packs to keep that genetic diversity up as much as possible. And then there's also a great program that WWF has been running where you can actually adopt a wild dog, which is another great program just to help with awareness of the species itself. And of course, just give a direct injection into these programs that we've just been chatting about in order to conserve them. So if you're interested, you can check it out on worldwildlife.org if you're keen on adopting a wild dog. So quickly, where's the golden pack today? My colleagues on the ground tell me that they've split up now into 3 different packs. There's still the original golden pack. So actually there's 4 packs now. There's the ash pack, 5 pack, and then the golden black pack, where they've all split up, and that is simply from that dispersal that we were talking about. Some females and males moving off on their own and starting their own packs, generally in adjacent home ranges. So they'll often encounter each other, but once they've split away from the pack, they'll tend to keep their distance as much as possible. So they have split up now. The original pack actually had pups last year. We've showed you some of those pictures, or I showed you some of those pictures earlier on today. Those were pups in 2020, so they had 7 new pups in the actual golden pack. So, and we've seen 1 or 2 that are still that golden color. So even though it's less, you're seeing less of that golden color than we were, it's still prevalent, and you're still seeing it from time to time, which is always quite exciting. As you can see, the pack is around 15 individuals now, including the pups. So it's still a lot of mouths to feed, and there's still a great opportunity to see them if you head out there. And they still hang around the same area for the most part, the golden pack in that Wimbra Plains area. As I mentioned, one of my favorite safari areas in Botswana, and a place where, I have a close. It has a close place in my heart, a special place in my heart, simply because I spent so much time there years ago as a manager. But an amazing group of animals, and one that I was lucky enough to see many times on foot, walking between my room and the main area, and just incredible animals themselves. But this special golden pack just always was something that just amazed me. So yeah, that is it today about the golden pack. So thank you, everybody. If you have any questions, please let me know. Kendall, you got anything? Shoot.
Oh yeah, we've got a lot of great questions for you. And I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question today, you can submit that in your control panel under the questions field. All right, so someone here noticed that the lighter color seems to be really good in terms of camouflaging, and so they're just wondering if this could potentially just be a genetic trait that's evolving for this pack.
It's possible. It's always hard to tell when you're looking at evolutionary camouflage traits like that, and you would suggest it's probably too quick in a couple of generations for that to happen. There's also a great show on at the moment, if you're interested in this stuff. It's actually on Netflix, I think, about, I think it's called Wildlife in Color. It's another David Attenborough show where they actually talk about this coloration in the wild. If you think of a tiger, the bright orange color of a tiger, it should stick out in the wild, but because of their prey, most of the prey species don't see those colors very well. So the lighter color of the dogs in this case wouldn't make much of a difference. It's simply the mottling itself that breaks up the shape of the animal that makes it more difficult for them to see. But I really do recommend that show if you get a chance. They show it in great detail. They show how the animals fade away when they show you how those prey species actually see. So even though, the coloration to us looks like it would be harder to see, to the prey species, it's much of a muchness, really.
So a lot of people are curious about the alphas and how they're determined in a pack. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, like so many of the big predators, they tend to duke it out. It's almost always the strongest, fittest, and they will fight for dominance. So when they disperse, as I said, you'll often get 3 or 4 males and 3 or 4 females. When they disperse, there will always be one of them that is slightly more dominant. So one who would have fought the others for dominance. When they meet up with the new pack, there'll be already established a dominant male and already established a dominant female. And then the rest, incredibly, will happily fall in line and support them as the alpha male and female, and the pack grows from there. So it's remarkable that they're not as successful as they should be. You know, looking at how they care for their young, how the dispersal is actually a really good system, and how committed they are to looking after each other. It's still remarkable that there are only around 4,000 left. But yeah, you know, the impact of people and domestic animals, together with, you know, with the threat of other predators, yeah, it's put them under huge pressure. But it's a really interesting dynamic, and it's one of the unique things for wild dogs, that alpha pack.
Mm-hmm. And what's the typical lifespan of a wild dog?
Oh, it's similar to your dog at home. You know, they're around the same size as a German Shepherd or so, but they live around 15 years. Would be a pretty good life for a wild dog. It's pretty hard out there. Most of them will make it 12 to 15. Yeah, at a push, about 15 years old.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned vaccinating domestic dogs, and there are a few people who are just wondering if there are any attempts at inoculating the wild dogs. For example, someone mentioned potentially leaving out meat that contains the drugs for them.
So yeah, look, they try not to have any impact in that way by ever putting food out, but you're 100% right. When the dogs are moved, so in those programs where we're actually moving to different meta populations, and the dogs are actually darted beforehand for a move to another reserve, when they do that, they will inoculate them against as much as they can. So they are doing it on a smaller scale, and that has obviously been hugely successful as well in helping with the tapering off of those diseases. So they do it when they do those movements of the animals themselves. So it is happening, but yeah, it's just that, you know, they need budgets. It's an expensive program, and so the more we can get involved, the more chance they have of actually keeping these populations going.
Mm-hmm. What does the white at the end of their tails mean? Is there any special significance for those?
Yeah, it's another good one. You know, with many of your predators, the lions, you know, they've got that dark patch on the end of the tail. Leopard have the little white patch as well. It's often suggested that those white or lighter or darker patches help with the other members of the pack, to keep track of them when they're running. You'll see sometimes when the dogs get excited that their tails almost puff out, and the white stands up even more. So it could be a following mechanism, and that tends to be the most common argument for, like I say, these dark or light colors on the tail.
If a pack splits up into separate packs, do the two become aggressive towards each other, or are they pretty amicable?
They will. Generally, though, the fights don't end in injury or violence. It's normally a good growling at each other, and then they'll move off. Because of the big home ranges, they almost have to have some tolerance of each other. So they'll often run through another pack's home range. And for the most part, because the areas are so big too, you don't have a lot of interaction between the species, or between the packs themselves. So yeah, they will fight if they come across each other, but for the most part, they actually just steer clear of each other. But they're no longer friends once they leave the pack, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Another question about disease here. Do the wild dogs have any diseases that domestic dogs don't get, or it seems that the ones you've mentioned are pretty common amongst domestic dogs?
Yeah, not that I know of, Kendall. I think that the ones that were listed are the only ones that they know of that are having a big impact on the dogs. So it's been, I mean, it's hard to say who had it first, for sure, but I think as far as they know, it's similar, very similar diseases to what domestic dogs have. Yeah.
Mhm. This is an interesting question about what to call wild dogs, since there's a few, it looks like there's a few names out there for these, and someone just wanted you to discuss, I guess maybe the controversy, or there's a discussion about the alternate names depending on where you are. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a great one. Yeah, I think at this point, the official name is still the African wild dog, but you can pick up a book, as you say, tomorrow, and it would say Cape hunting dog, painted wolf, which is very much, as I mentioned, a direct translation of the actual scientific name. At this point, it hasn't been changed. There is talk of doing that because there is this idea that the name wild dogs doesn't suggest how special they are. Sometimes people get the impression that they are simply feral dogs living in the African wild. But the argument is still ongoing. A lot of the conservation groups are trying to push to change it to painted dog or painted wolf. Even African hunting or Cape hunting dog is suggested to have some negative connotation. So look, it's a really good question. At this stage, there isn't an answer. It's still a debate about where they'll end up on it in terms of their conservation, and trying to make it as iconic as possible. But I think the more we do these kinds of chats, the more people will know that African wild dogs, that name could work just as well as any other. But I have to admit, I'm quite prone to the painted wolf name. So if I had a vote, it would be the painted wolf.
All right. Do wild dogs present a threat to humans on the ground?
As far as I've ever seen in my career, no. I've never heard of anyone being attacked by dogs, wild dogs. As I mentioned, when I worked in this area, I would walk between our room and the main area, which was off the path, during the day, and I bumped into that pack many times. And they actually just look at you and keep trotting on. They showed no interest whatsoever in us. So much so that they actually killed a few impala right in the area where the game drive vehicles came back from drive, right next to the lodge. So they had no real fear of us, but at the same time, there was no aggression towards us at all, and they wouldn't generally come within, I would say, within at least 50 feet of us. They would trot off if you were on foot. In the vehicles, they were much more relaxed. We could actually get much closer to them, as you saw in a lot of those photographs. But on foot, they're actually quite skittish, and they'll readily run away. But yeah, we were never felt threatened by them. No.
Mm-hmm. So when and where are the best odds for viewing wild dogs?
Oh, that's a loaded question. Look, these regions that we're looking at, I mean, if you look at that distribution map that we chatted about, the Botswana is certainly one of the best places in the world to see wild dogs in the wild. There's some figures show that around at least a third of the population of wild dogs left in the wild are in Botswana. So around the Occupango, in the southern part of Botswana, in an area known as Madikwe, it's pretty much between South Africa and Botswana. Those two regions, and then probably Tanzania, I would say as well, are certainly the most popular areas, and of course, Kruger National Park as well. All of them, great opportunity for seeing dogs. And it comes down to a bit of luck, as of course. If you arrive at the time of year where they're denning and they happen to den on the reserve where you are, your sightings are likely to be excellent. So if you're really keen on dogs, you can actually always give the lodge a call, or give us at NatHab a call, and actually just chat about it. What is the latest information from the lodge? Have you guys seen dogs? Are they denning? Is there a good opportunity? Because it's such a flowing environment, and as we spoke about, such huge home ranges, different environments, the delta changing every year. So it's tricky, but yeah, if they're denning, and as I mentioned, they tend to den around the winter months, March to September. If they're denning, you've got a very good chance of seeing them most days, and very good chance of seeing them hunt, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, if for anyone watching, if you are interested in going on safari to try to see wild dogs, definitely give our office a call, and we can talk you through what the best trips are for that. All right, well, we're getting close to the top of the hour, Russell. Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. I'm going to hand it back over to you for our closing comments.
You're most welcome, Kendall, and it's always a pleasure being with you folks. I really enjoy these webinars. It keeps me thinking about our wonderful times in the bush and these incredible experiences. Hopefully I get to meet some of you at some point in the near future when you come out and join us on some of these incredible adventures. But I hope you enjoyed this little insight into the golden pack. As I said, one of the most amazing groups of animals and unique animals I've ever seen, of one of Africa's most endangered species. So really special to me, and I hope you enjoyed it. But I'll be back, and we'll see you all again soon. Have a good weekend.
Thanks again, Russell. This was a great way to end the week. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. And just note that Monday is a holiday here in the US, so our office will be closed. So be sure to join us Tuesday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. And of course, keep an eye out for our Sunday e-news. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Bye.